Charred timber, the acrid scent of melted synthetic polymers, and ankle-deep gray ash form the chaotic aftermath of a structural fire. For decades, a post-blaze crime scene was treated as a blackened canvas where investigators read burn marks like ancient runes, confident that the fire had left an undeniable, readable signature. They looked for V-shaped soot stains on walls, crazed glass with spiderweb fractures, and concrete floors that had chipped and popped from intense heat. These physical artifacts were not viewed as clues to be tested, but as the definitive, undeniable handwriting of an arsonist. To the untrained eye, the devastation of a residential fire is total, but to mid-20th century fire marshals, it was an open book governed by inherited wisdom. They relied on a passed-down oral tradition of fire behavior, a set of heuristics accepted as absolute truth within the investigative community. If a fire burned hot and fast enough to melt steel bed frames, they concluded a liquid accelerant must have been used. If the floorboards exhibited deep, irregular, puddle-like charring, it was immediately classified as a pour pattern, indicating exactly where gasoline or kerosene had supposedly been splashed. These field observations routinely evolved into capital murder charges, carrying immense weight within the justice system. Prosecutors built entire cases around the testimony of seasoned arson investigators who possessed immense authority but little formal scientific training in chemistry or thermodynamics. Court records indicate that juries rarely questioned these confident assertions, easily swayed by the visceral, visual evidence of a blistered floor. Fates were sealed, and life sentences were handed down based on an investigative framework that was entirely devoid of empirical validation. The collision between this established folklore and the actual laws of physics eventually exposed a catastrophic systemic failure in fire forensics. Fire dynamics, the complex study of how ignition, fuel, and oxygen interact in enclosed spaces, revealed that many traditional indicators of arson were actually naturally occurring phenomena. The scientific method demanded that hypotheses be tested, and when researchers finally began testing the foundational rules of arson investigation, the results were deeply alarming. Take the phenomenon of spalling, the chipping and flaking of concrete during a fire. For generations, investigators testified under oath that spalling only occurred when a highly combustible liquid accelerant burned directly on the concrete surface, causing localized, extreme heat. According to forensic reports from modern fire engineers, spalling is simply the result of rapid thermal expansion and the vaporization of moisture trapped inside the concrete itself. It happens in completely accidental fires just as frequently as intentional ones, meaning the presence of chipped concrete indicated nothing more than the presence of intense heat. The devastating human cost of this reliance on junk science crystallized in Corsicana, Texas, on a freezing morning in December 1991. A devastating house fire claimed the lives of 3 young children, leaving their father, Cameron Todd Willingham, standing outside with minor burns. Within days, local fire investigators sifted through the smoldering, waterlogged debris and officially declared the blaze a deliberate act of murder. Their conclusion relied entirely on the archaic mythology of fire investigation. The primary investigator pointed to multiple distinct areas of origin: heavy charring under the aluminum threshold of the front door, and brown rings on the concrete porch, which he confidently identified as pour patterns. He theorized that a liquid accelerant had been distributed throughout the hallways, deliberately creating an inescapable trap for the children sleeping inside. The prosecution weaponized these flawed interpretations during the 1992 trial to devastating effect. The jury was presented with a narrative built on discredited theories, reinforced by an expert witness who claimed the fire burned with an unnatural, accelerant-fueled intensity that only a murderer could orchestrate. Willingham maintained his innocence, but the visual power of the burn patterns, presented as infallible scientific fact, overwhelmed his defense. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. As Willingham languished on death row, the broader forensic community was undergoing a quiet, data-driven revolution. Scientists began conducting full-scale burn tests in controlled laboratory environments, meticulously documenting the progression of compartmentalized fires using modern sensors and thermal imaging. These controlled experiments illuminated a terrifying and previously misunderstood phenomenon known as flashover. Flashover is the critical transition phase in the development of a contained fire. When a fire burns in an enclosed room, it creates a layer of superheated toxic gases that accumulates at the ceiling. As this thermal radiation intensifies and banks downward, it simultaneously heats all combustible items in the room to their auto-ignition temperatures. In a matter of seconds, everything in the room bursts into flames simultaneously, transforming a fire in a room into a room on fire. The implications of flashover completely dismantled the foundational pillars of traditional arson investigation. Post-flashover fires produced the exact same physical artifacts that old-school investigators had confidently attributed to liquid accelerants. The intense floor-level burning, the V-shaped patterns on multiple walls, and the melted metals were not proof of arson. They were simply the predictable, scientifically verifiable aftermath of a room transitioning to full room involvement. Recognizing the urgent need for empirical rigor, the National Fire Protection Association published a landmark document in 1992, the very same year Willingham was convicted. Titled NFPA 921 Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations, this manual sought to establish a scientifically valid methodology for fire scene analysis. It demanded that investigators apply the scientific method, formulate hypotheses based on objective data, and rigorously test those hypotheses against the physical evidence before reaching a conclusion. NFPA 921 explicitly repudiated the folklore that had dominated the field for nearly a century. It formally categorized concepts like spalling, crazed glass, and visually identified pore patterns as unreliable indicators of accelerants when observed in post-flashover environments. The guide mandated that investigators must account for ventilation, fuel loads, and the physics of radiant heat before concluding a fire was intentionally set, transforming fire investigation from an intuitive art into a rigorous forensic science. This scientific awakening arrived too late to stop the momentum of the Texas justice system, but it eventually triggered a post-conviction reckoning in the Willingham case. In 2004, mere weeks before his scheduled execution, a renowned fire scientist and chemist named Gerald Hurst was asked to review the original trial evidence. Hurst systematically applied the modern principles of NFPA 921 to the photographs, diagrams, and witness testimonies from the 1991 investigation. His conclusions were absolute and chilling. According to his expert report, every single indicator of arson cited at the trial was scientifically invalid. The alleged pore patterns on the floor were the natural result of flashover and burning debris falling from the ceiling. The charring under the door was caused by ventilation, as the fire actively sought oxygen from outside the structure, drawing the flames toward the threshold in a well-documented dynamic known as a ventilation-generated pattern. Hurst's report demonstrated that there was no scientific basis to classify the fire as arson, meaning it was, by all modern forensic standards, an accidental blaze. Despite this explosive exculpatory evidence, evidence favorable to the defendant that fundamentally dismantled the state's case, the state of Texas refused to halt the execution. Cameron Todd Willingham was put to death on February 17, 2004, maintaining his innocence until his final breath. The execution ignited a firestorm of controversy within the legal and scientific communities, forcing a deeply uncomfortable mirror onto the justice system. It forced courts and lawmakers to confront a terrifying reality, acknowledging that the state had likely executed an innocent man based on debunked junk science. The Texas Forensic Science Commission eventually launched an unprecedented inquiry into the Willingham case, marking the first time a state agency formally investigated a potential wrongful execution based on flawed forensic methodology. The commission enlisted independent fire experts who fully corroborated Hurst's findings. Their reports systematically deconstructed the original arson investigation, noting that the methodologies used in 1991 were fundamentally flawed even by the standards emerging at the time. As testified by multiple reviewing experts, the inquiry highlighted a deeply entrenched resistance within the criminal justice system to acknowledge the evolution of forensic science, particularly when that evolution threatened the finality of past convictions. The shadow of the Willingham case triggered a nationwide audit of arson convictions, sending shockwaves through innocence projects and appellate courts. Defense attorneys began scouring prison rosters, searching for inmates convicted during the era of folklore forensics. They found dozens of cases where men and women were serving life sentences based on the exact same discredited burn patterns, spalling myths, and subjective interpretations of fire behavior. Slowly, the appellate courts began to respond to the undeniable weight of the new science. Inmates like Christine Bunch in Indiana and Hontak Lee in Pennsylvania were exonerated after spending decades behind bars for fires that killed their loved ones. In each of these landmark reversals, modern fire dynamics experts testified that the original arson classifications were scientifically insupportable, establishing crucial legal precedents that mandated forensic testimony be grounded in empirical data rather than subjective interpretation. Today, the landscape of fire forensics is unrecognizable from the era of intuition and myth. Investigators arrive at scenes equipped with an understanding of thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, and the complex chemistry of combustion. The guidelines established by NFPA 921 are now the universally accepted standard of care across the discipline. A fire is presumed accidental until physical evidence, rigorously analyzed and laboratory tested, definitively proves otherwise. The identification of accelerants now relies on sophisticated chemical analysis rather than visual guesswork on a charred floorboard. Fire debris is carefully collected, maintaining a strict chain of custody, the chronological documentation that records the sequence of control, transfer, and analysis of physical evidence. Once secured, the debris is transported to the laboratory where scientists use gas chromatography mass spectrometry to isolate and identify the unique molecular signatures of ignitable liquids. This analytical method separates complex mixtures into individual chemical compounds, providing objective, quantifiable data. Gas chromatography mass spectrometry can distinguish between the natural chemical byproducts of burning synthetic carpet and the specific hydrocarbon profile of evaporated gasoline. This data cannot be misinterpreted as a natural burn pattern. It either proves the chemical presence of an accelerant or it does not, removing human bias from the equation. Yet, even with these technological advancements, fire investigation remains one of the most uniquely challenging disciplines in forensic science. Unlike a traditional crime scene where biological evidence or fingerprints are left behind, a fire actively consumes, alters, and destroys the very clues investigators seek to uncover. The task of reconstructing a timeline of ignition from a pile of saturated, collapsed ash requires an immense degree of precision and a profound respect for the limitations of the scientific method. The evolution of arson investigation stands as a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in investigative complacency. It took the tragic loss of life, the devastation of wrongful convictions, and the execution of Cameron Todd Willingham to force a critical re-evaluation of accepted truths. The transition from folklore to physics was not just a scientific upgrade for the forensic community, it was a necessary and long overdue moral reckoning for the entire justice system. Science replaced the old myths because the justice system can never afford to guess when human lives and liberty are at stake. The charred remains of a home hold the truth of how a fire began, but extracting that truth requires objective data, relentless testing, and an unwavering commitment to facts over assumptions. In the modern era of fire forensics, the evidence must speak for itself, measured and validated, ensuring that the devastating power of fire is never again compounded by the tragedy of a false accusation.